What's up, guys? Michael here. Now, you don't have to be much of a crypto enthusiast to know that something weird is going on with digital art, and that something is called NFTs. See, Auction House Christie's just sold its first purely digital artwork and the accompanying non-fungible token for a chill $69 million. Both art insiders and normies were left collectively stunned. The work in question is Everyday's, the first 5,000 days, by digital artist Beeple. It's a composite image of the artist's daily digital pictures made over the course of 13 and a half years. This wasn't the only big-ticket NFT sale either. Grimes has sold millions of dollars in blockchain art, while an NFT of the Nyan Cat sold for more than $500,000 worth of crypto. And so, since basically everyone at Wisecrack was pretty baffled, we started digging. We had so many questions, mostly, why? Is this just a gimmick? Are these millionaire NFT consumers just way smarter than us? Do they just really want to give artists their due with fair compensation? And what we found ended up raising a ton of questions about the art world. Like, why do we take for granted the fact that a painting like this receives bids for millions of dollars, while a painting of me showing whole as of now received 0 bids? It made us wonder, what if we treat Beeple's $69 million payday as less of a novelty and more of a natural progression of the art world? One that's been underway for the last 5-ish decades. Let's find out in this Wisecrack edition on non-fungible tokens. Before we jump in, a quick word on NFTs. NFTs are basically unique units of data on a blockchain that are used to represent a digital item. They act as proof of ownership of that digital item, and some people think they're a pretty big scam. That's because when you buy an NFT, you're more or less purchasing a super special file with a digital seal of authenticity that says even if this file is widely available on the internet, it's actually you who own it. Oh, and they're also real bad for the environment, but that's a topic for another day. To understand the wild money being thrown at the Beeples and Grimeses of the world, we need to talk about an art movement that emerged in full force around 2011 and was soon given the scornful nickname zombie formalism. Let's unpack the story by starting with what's formalism and what's a zombie version of it. Here's the deal. Formalist art critics, who really came to prominence after World War II, believed in judging artwork based entirely on the success of the aesthetics. Colors, lines, shapes, rather than any social, political, or ideological context. So, sorry Picasso, we don't care if Guernica is about the Spanish Civil War, we care that it looks dope. Some formalists, like critic Clement Greenberg, also believed that art that represented actual things or people was inherently inferior to the more pure abstract expressionism exemplified by the likes of notable paint dripper Jackson Pollock. These abstract works, it was thought, reached for a higher kind of truth. That said, Greenberg's views started really falling out of favor in the late 70s as high art people became increasingly preoccupied with contextualizing artwork in all the ways Greenberg hated. So for instance, you'd have someone like Jean-Michel Basquiat being discussed and celebrated for the ways they use symbolism and commented on the art world at large. Fast forward a few decades and we can get to the zombie part of zombie formalism. These mostly young artists reviving a decades-old way of thinking about and making art, but as a shell of its former self. In the vein of their predecessors, they were focused on technique, color, and composition more than symbolism or context. It was also characterized by what art critic Jerry Saltz describes as the illusion of true originality. The movement was fueled by first, like the first painting made via electroplating, or the first painting made via fire extinguisher, which, okay, sounds pretty cool. Saltz notes that the art felt new and dangerous, but not too much so. It also seemed cerebral and was tailor-made to look good in wealthy people's fancy contemporary homes and on Instagram. The paintings all looked pretty similar in their simple elegance, exemplified by Lucien Smith's Rain series. They could also generally be made very efficiently and sold like $100,000 hotcakes. Newbie art collectors, many of whom hailed from the finance world, loved them and were excited to speculate wildly on artists whose street cred seemed to be majorly on the rise. Though they're aesthetically super different, it's hard not to see some surface similarities between the current NFT bonanza and this art moment at its peak. Let's take a close look at the imagery that actually constitutes Beeple's Everyday's The First 5,000 Days art. Keep in mind, each of these individual tiles is now technically worth nearly $14,000. As one ArtNet journalist notes, the images include a lot of porny cartoons and ironic political caricatures that seem to be aiming for edgy but end up more in the camp of memes your boomer dad might forward after 2-for-1 margarita hour at Chili's. It has tones of subversiveness if watching Lincoln spank Trump strikes you as particularly subversive, yet doesn't appear to possess a clear ideology. Many of the works could best be described as different kinds of racist or sexist posting. It also pulls pretty shamelessly from memey internet aesthetics seen on Tumblr and DeviantArt. And look, I'm not a monster. I love weird internet art and I love memes, but when exactly is a meme worth 14 grand? Beeple's work was tailor-made for internet consumption and in many cases clearly dashed off pretty quickly. In fact, Beeple told Insider that he never expected to sell a piece of his digital art for more than $1,000. Like many works of zombie formalism, Everydays is ultimately most remarkable for two completely non-artistic reasons. A, its novelty. Here as the first purely digital art piece to make it through the gold standard of industry art auctions, and B, its resulting price tag. The same could be said of Nyencat, which is like old internet novelty wrapped in new internet novelty, a novelty quesarito, if you will. Now, it may not seem unusual these days to judge art primarily by its market value, but just a few generations ago, such a perspective would have been virtually unthinkable. It's because the idea of defining and measuring the true value of art by its price, i.e. as a commodity, is relatively new. As curator Henry Geldzahler noted, abstract painters who honed their craft in the 40s and 50s were more focused on projecting the immanence of God in their work than eking out a high price point. Though many artists were still aware of the patron class they were appealing to and the monetary worth of their work, this kind of calculating was considered distasteful and thus kept private. Art collectors in turn were focused on, say, building an aesthetically pleasing collection of work you could show off to friends at dinner parties or show off to the world by loaning it out to a museum. It wasn't primarily about the monetary value of the art itself. This began to change somewhat drastically in the early 70s with the meteoric rise in the value of pop art, a movement that had been since the 1950s preoccupied with the notion of branding and commodities. Exemplified by Andy Warhol, these artists honed international brands, and their work increasingly began attracting more investment-minded collectors. Of course, as sculptor Richard Serra notes, artists like Warhol simultaneously branded themselves while mocking the media that perpetuated those brands. That is, there was a subversiveness to this ethos of commodification of art. However, the criticality and subversiveness that Warhol embodied has been, according to Serra, lost. And that loss began in earnest in the 80s, as art, along with just about everything else, became fully commodified. As art historian Tiernan Morgan argues, the art world as we recognize it today was largely manufactured by the decade's commercial prowess, and we're still grappling with its fallout. This sea change was in part due to the economic surge of money belonging to the top 1%. It was also due to increased marketing efforts by auction houses and the meteoric rise of galleries and art fairs. By the mid-80s, front-page stories about despicably expensive auction sales constituted much of the media's coverage of the art world. This mindset that art equals money would only become more entrenched at the turn of the new century. At this point, according to art expert Michael Finlay, serious critical discourse was drowned out by the noise of the marketplace. At the same time, the typical artist has become increasingly preoccupied with creating, maintaining, and increasing his or her market. Whereas many artists in the 60s, like Edward Keenholz, roundly mocked the very idea of commodifying art in general, many artists have now become comfortable seeing their work primarily as commodities to be bought and sold. Indeed, one of the fallen stars of zombie formalism, Lucian Smith, admitted recently that his time in the spotlight was about sucking up to collectors and trying to sell for the highest prices. He now laments, that stuff isn't real. That's not art. So we might ask, is a Grimes or Beeple NFT really worth millions? But it's kind of the wrong question, one fueled by an art market cynically concerned with price rather than merit. Fittingly, as art became more commodified, collecting art became increasingly less about amassing a pretty collection of Monets and more about creating a pretty investment portfolio. Nowadays, much of art is bought only to be stored in high-end international warehouses, far away from the homes and walls of the buyer. All of which is to say, these days, the price of an artwork is the point. This has perhaps never been more clear than in another recent blockchain purchase, that of a Banksy painting. After purchasing the NFT for a work by your favorite rat portraitist, the new owners proceeded to burn the original painting in order to ensure the exclusive value of their token. The breathless media coverage is probably just a happy side effect, right? Anyway, here we see how the price of the commodity, i.e. the NFT, trumps all, even the cultural worth of the original tangible work of art. So now that we know how the art market became a commercialized mini horror show, it's worth asking, how does the market set a price for a piece of artwork? The answer? Pretty randomly. As art critic Robert Hughes put it, the price of a work of art is an index of pure, irrational desires. Part of this has to do with the auction setting, which is literally designed to foster reckless, spontaneous decision-making. Notably, while Christie's will typically set an estimated value, they chose not to on every days because of the novelty of an NFT. As a result, the sky quite literally was the limit. As prices in an auction climb, so does excitement. As Finlay notes, people are lured by art that, because it was expensive, presumably must be good. Often this reason replaced meaningful scrutiny of the object. There's another factor that makes certain big-ticket pieces of art worth more money than God. As Christie's estimates, there are approximately 150 collectors in the world with the means and desire to spend more than $20 million on a piece of artwork. And I'm sad to say, not one of them is my friend. Many of these investors, hardly art experts in and of themselves, rely on the help of seasoned art advisors who tend to have relatively homogeneous taste. As a result, as scholar Ola Velthus explains, the art market functions as a big consensus marketing machine. That is to say, it runs primarily on hype. Art advisors keep track of which artists' brands are currently favored by powerful curators, collectors, and museums. And as Velthus concludes, because everybody is, to some extent at least, looking at the same signals, at one point they start agreeing on who are the most desirable artists. As a result, top collectors tend to gravitate towards the same artists and works, or the same trends, thus driving prices super way up. Of course, that might explain the exorbitant price tag on, say, a Jeff Koons pile of Play-Doh. Before you scoff, please note that this is a real art piece that was purchased for over $22 million. But Everydays doesn't exactly strike you right away as being the kind of art that advisors would stake their reputation on, so color us still mystified. That said, there are some consistent trends that tend to ascribe particular value to certain pieces of art. Also, fun fact, blue and red paintings inexplicably tend to sell for more. But overall, scale tends to be a huge determinant in the value of art. If you want to sell something for millions of dollars, it better command a lot of wall space. Obviously, Everydays, composed of 5,000 images, is the digital equivalent to taking up the entire wall of a museum. Another big factor is novelty. As we saw with zombie formalism, the novelty of an art purchase can also intrinsically give it value. In this case, the prospect of being the first collector to buy an NFT from a major auction house no doubt played a role in the month-long bidding war that drove the price up to, again, and I cannot stress this enough, $69 million. But there's also the matter of self-interest. One of the big reasons that certain artists like Andy Warhol have become worth so much is actually a little bit sketchy. Art collectors who already own a couple of Warhols might bid incredibly high on the next Warhol that comes up at an art auction. It's because doing so helps the Warhol brand in the eyes of the art world, consequently inflating the value of their pre-existing soup can collection. Of course, their old Warhols didn't suddenly improve in quality. Curator and dealer Kenny Scherker notes that this phenomenon was especially prevalent during the era of zombie formalism, saying there was definitely price manipulation at the beginning, with investors bidding up the works at auction to the hundreds of thousands of dollars. We suspect something similar, though way more expensive, is going on with the sale of Everydays. The two buyers, Vignesh Sundaresan, aka Metakovan, and Anand Venkatswaran, are cryptocurrency entrepreneurs. Sundaresan started Metapurse, aka a crypto-exclusive fund that specializes in identifying early-stage projects across blockchain infrastructure, finance, art, unique collectibles, and virtual estate. That's a fancy way of saying, we invest in nice digital Metakovan had already bought several other art pieces by Beeple months before the recent auction. He subsequently divided ownership of this body of work, collectively called B20, and sold shares of them publicly via B20 tokens. But here's where it gets kinda juicy. He kept 59% of the tokens for himself, while his favorite business partner, one Mr. Beeple, owns 2%. Independent crypto journalist Amy Castor argues that the purchase of Everydays thus represented a consequential conflict of interest. She postulates that it was all probably a mere publicity stunt to A, publicize Metapurse and the whole B20 package, and B, increase the value of that package, i.e. the rest of Metakovan's existing Beeple collection, thus making B20s more valuable and a much more exciting investment opportunity. After the sale of Everydays, the value of a B20 coin shot up from just was 36 cents in January to $23, though it has since dropped to $7, but still, it's not small bananas. The two buyers have since issued a statement claiming that this purchase was intended to show Indians and people of color that they too could be patrons, that crypto was an equalizing power between the West and the rest, and that the global South was rising. So if it increased their collection's values, that apparently is just a happy side effect. Anyway, does all this mean that NFTs are the future? A slew of finance blogs might have you thinking so, as well as Metacoven's recent declaration that the work will one day be worth $1 billion. But of course, when it comes to something as fickle as the art market, it's never wise to put all your money on the latest fad. As we saw with many of the top zombie formalists, something that's the toast of the art market one day can have an undignified fall from grace the next. Take one dealer who invested $100,000 in a zombie work by Hugh Scott Douglas in 2014, planning to flip it for even more. He found himself selling it for just $20,000 a mere 2 years later, after, kind of hilariously, trying and failing to hawk it on eBay. He lamented, "I feel like we were a little bit drunk and didn't think of the consequences. Then the bottom fell out, everyone got stuck with their pants down." Sounds like my first time. Will the same be said of everydays? Maybe? But what do you guys think? Are NFTs the future of the art market, or just the latest bubble in one of the weirdest luxury economies? Let us know in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for all your support. Hit that subscribe button like it's worth $69 million, and don't forget to ring that bell. And as always, thanks for watching. Later.